That's my subtle hello. So hi, thank you very much for braving the cold yet again to come to our event tonight. I was just thinking about last year, at this time when we had Nina Spada here. It was a snowstorm, like a blizzard, and still a lot of our registrants still came through the blizzard, and you have done so not through a blizzard but through extremely cold weather, so I thank you for coming. My name is Tyson Seaburn. If you don't know me, I'm the president of TESOL Toronto at the moment, and I would like to welcome you to our February event with Antonella and Farahnaz. A couple of things quickly to announce before we get started. You all got this little program today, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things that are coming up next in case you are not familiar with what's going on. We have 2 more events planned for this season before the summer break, and the next one is Market Yourself to Employment. So it is an event. Every March or April we have an employment-related event. This year it is going to be hosted by Jessica Webster, who is an expert in employment, and TESOL as well. And she's going to talk to you about how to brand yourself, right? Something that is very important these days in the online community. That is April 17th, and it will be at the Lillian H. Smith Public Library, which is just around the corner on College. There will be some more information about that, including registration tips and things like that on our website. It's not there yet, but it will be coming pretty soon. And of course, most of you are on our email list, so you'll be getting an email about that too. And hopefully you've also paid attention to the fact that, of course, our spring conference is coming up. It's around the corner. Last year we had a 2-day event for the first time, and it was really successful. So we're going to do that again this year. And you've got a little bit of information about it on that flyer. This year our special guests are Jamie Keddy, who is an author of Images and a new book coming out about how to use video in the classroom from Oxford University Press. So he's coming over to do a plenary and a workshop for us. And we also have Jim Scrivener, who will be coming over as well. And he's the author, more or less, of some very famous teacher training books. So if you've taken the CELTA course, you probably have, in fact, used his book. We will have the event. Last year we had it at Hart House on Friday, which was some workshops and a plenary and a catered dinner. And this year we'll be having it at Victoria College. So it's a little bit closer to the subway, actually, to Museum Station. So hopefully that's going to be good, and it has the same feel actually as Hart House. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then the Saturday conference is as usual. It'll be in this vicinity, and you know the drill for that. We are still looking for presenters. So if you're interested in presenting at this year's conference, you can navigate the internet to this site, which actually on Internet Explorer, which is the worst browser, I might imagine, doesn't show properly. But in any case, if you go to this website, which is listed on here, you can see a bunch of things, one of which includes information about the plenaries and the call for presenters. So if you click on there, you will be taken to a spot where you just click on our little concrete block, and then you can submit a proposal. So if you're interested in presenting at this year's conference, please do take the time before March 30th, because that's the deadline, to submit a proposal, and hopefully you'll be accepted, and we'll see you at the conference. So without further ado, I would like to bring Arlene Samlasing, another member of the TESOL Toronto Executive, up, and she is the chair of this event, so she's going to introduce the 2 speakers for tonight. So thank you.
Thanks, Tyson. Obviously, you all think this topic is as important as I do, so thanks again for being here tonight. We are very lucky to have 2 guests with us here tonight. Antonella Valeo is assistant professor at York University where she teaches applied linguistics in the graduate program and ESL to undergraduates. And before taking on this position at York, she taught ESL in a range of contexts, supervised ESL teachers in an adult education program, and taught TESOL for several years. She's organized teacher conferences, developed professional development initiatives, and led the research team for the development of the TESOL Ontario Post-TESOL Certificate Framework. Her most recent research has focused on issues related to novice language teachers and ESP teachers in occupation-specific programs. And we have also Farahnaz Faez, who is an associate professor in applied linguistics in the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Ontario. She teaches second language education courses in the teacher education and graduate program. Her research interests include second language teaching and learning, pre-service and in-service ESL teacher education, internationally educated teachers and English language teachers, or rather learners, in the K-12 programs. She's taught and supervised ESL and TESOL programs for several years. So again, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Antonella and Farahnaz. Thank you.
All right. Hi. Good evening. Thank you, Tyson, for arranging this, or for inviting us, and yes, thanks to all of you for actually coming out tonight. Wasn't sure what the turnout would be with this kind of weather. It seemed balmy about a week ago, so you're doing pretty well tonight. And I'm going to see, I've been told to use this microphone. Yeah, okay. Okay, so tonight, first of all, this is our screen, but I thank Tyson if that was, I don't know whose idea it was to put the brain image there. It was yours. Okay, so thank you for that, because in fact that's how we'd like to frame the evening. This is a rather unusual event, we think, in that it's not about corrective feedback or anything else that's going to help you teach a better lesson tomorrow or help someone else teach a better lesson. It really is intended to be about thinking and talking about PD. And when Arlene first approached me about it, one of the reasons I was excited about it is because we hope to shape a rather different event for you. And Farahnaz and I come from quite a few different roles. We, as you said, as Arlene told you, we have been teachers, we've been supervisors, we've been researchers, we are researchers right now. And we hope to bring a perspective that might speak to quite a few different roles that many of you play. And I know some of the faces here tonight, and I can certainly see that there is a real range of individuals and participants. So I hope that there is something tonight that does speak to you. We hope to shape this as something that's rather informal, in that to take advantage of the small crowd that we do have here, and that we'd like to hear from you. But we will also start with a rather traditional format, and that is that we will be presenting a few ideas, concepts, principles that are close to our hearts in terms of what we see in Language Teacher PD, and that we hope will inspire you to think about it as well in different terms. Okay, I've got two computers here, so I'm going to figure out which one I'm working with. There we go. Okay. So what we'd like to do is begin, again, in a rather traditional way. Each of you has a sheet with you. Yes? Does anyone not have a sheet? Oh, okay. And are there any others just around? I guess we have more here. While those are coming out, I'll explain what we're going to do with them. In the abstract, or the description for tonight, we posed a few questions. Questions that at first seemed quite simple, but we posed them in our description because we wanted to have the chance to look at them possibly in a different way. And that's what you have here tonight in front of you. The questions we posed in our description were, one, what is the goal of PD? And the reason we bring this up is because a simple answer that you hear in much of the literature is student outcomes. It's about getting students to learn better. And we'd like to look at this question a little bit differently. It's not to say that that's not the goal of Language Teacher PD, but we'd like to see if perhaps there are other reasons why we are part of this. The second question is, why is it important? And this may sound like it's similar to the first question, but in fact, the second question for us speaks to the notion of investment. We were talking just a few minutes ago and thinking that, in fact, you're quite a different crowd because you came to an event that was pitched as quite a different kind of PD, and you actually made it here on a very cold day, and no offense to the sandwiches, but I doubt that that's the draw. So I'm not sure if people actually brave the cold for that, but it's great that you're fed. So there's something different about you as well that drew you here tonight, and I'm hoping perhaps at the end we can learn a little bit about why you're here, because this is not the ordinary kind of event. So why is it important? Why bother, really? The next one was, how can or should it be pursued? And can, because there are options out there, but should, as in which ones really should we be looking at? And Fairness and I have participated in a lot of PD, we've organized PD, we've spearheaded initiatives, we supported teachers in PD, and we've seen a range of successful, less successful. But it's not, my experience is that it's not necessarily the event or the activity, but whether it's actually matched to the individual. And this is something that we'd like to raise tonight. So hence the should. And I'm going to add one more question for you. And that is, how do you know good PD? And this seems again like a simple question, but I guess we all know good PD after it's over, because we leave with something, but that doesn't really help if we're making decisions about where to go next. And the research has shown that, in fact, it's a combination of activities that works best, and Fairness will touch more on that later on. So what you have in front of you is a sheet that has these 4 questions. What we'd like to do is to just give you a chance, now that you're all comfortable, warm, and fed, okay, to take a few minutes and jot down whatever comes to mind. Initially, we had a notion that we would get you to chat with somebody. Some of you are sitting on your own. I leave you to do it as you please, but take a few minutes, either talk it over with someone, just write down a few ideas. We'll come back to this afterwards as well, okay? Your own input and what you feel about language teacher PD. However, whatever literature or research we look at, and quite a bit of it comes from K-12, it's useful to us if we place it in the context of our own language teaching. And so I would like to spend a few minutes talking about exactly that, what context we're working in. Because that's really the answer in terms of what PD will work or not work, what you get out of certain PD initiatives and activities. And the context of language teaching, there are aspects that characterize the work we do. And when I say we, this includes university language teaching, it also includes non-credit community teaching, it includes quite a wide range, but you will see that what I share with you here speaks more to some contexts than others. So the literature certainly describes the same aspects, but I wanted to let you know that it's also confirmed by research in the field with many of you. So some of what I share with you tonight came out of recent surveys that many of you might have participated in. Surveys with TESOL Ontario, for example. Survey with the post-TESOL certificate training. So over the years, there have been a few attempts to learn a little bit about what we do and what the field is about by asking all of us. So the nature of language teaching, first of all, is context dependent. And what this means is that every time we step into a class, it's a particular class with particular students in a particular program. No 2 classes are the same within a program, certainly no 2 programs are the same. And even though this is certainly true of all teaching, and not to say that in K-12 you've got identical groups of students, of kids, there is still some structure to that world that we don't often have in ours. So very context dependent. And because of this, related to this, we have a high degree of autonomy. So we have curriculum guidelines, we have resources, okay? As opposed to a curriculum or a textbook that we all follow. And this is the rhetoric that we have in our field, because really what we're used to doing is adapting rather than adopting. And this is a strength for us, but nevertheless, it's something that leads to isolation as well. Okay, so while we have a high degree of autonomy, We also, what is typical of our field is that there is the danger of isolation. It could be physical, in that very often we go to where the community is. So you may find yourself physically isolated, but it could also be curricular, in that even in a program that has, say, 5 different levels, certainly the level 2 teacher would like to believe that you're covering X, Y, and Z in level 1, but let's face it, if you don't, they'll just catch them up. Okay, so there is a certain insularity, even within our teaching within programs, let alone the fact that many of us don't teach in very large programs. It's also characterized by short-term funding, and I struggled with how to say this exactly, but whether it's student tuition or government funding, it is not long-term. I've been in situations where I've basically been waiting on the phone in private language schools to hear whether there were enough students for me to be working on Monday, and that was Friday. So I've been there. I've also been in programs where, government-funded programs, where I've been waiting to see if the following month the class was still open and whether I would be working. So what we're plagued with, and I say plagued because there are issues with this, is a very short-term formula that we live with. Again, just to compare it to K-12, with K-12, at least when you're employed in September, you know you'll be employed in June. There's at least that much, but more often more than that. Diverse learner populations, and certainly when I say diverse, I mean age spans of several decades, education proficiency, sometimes within one class, sometimes within a program, just sometimes within our own careers. So the diversity cannot be overstated. So, and the last one is actually, and I struggle with this too, how to put this, part-time, short-term programs with a specialized focus. The rise of the occupation-specific language teaching, the enhanced language teaching, where you are given a class for 10 weeks, 2 days a week, and then you're not sure what happens next. So these are ways in which government funding certainly is trying to serve learners, but it has an impact on our own field. And finally, unregulated compensation. This one too was a struggle. We talked about how exactly do we say this without sounding like we're complaining too loudly, but we're going to get the point home. It's not a unionized environment. This is not to say that all environments are better if they're unionized, but the issue here is that pay is not regulated, meaning that there's still a wide variety. And recent surveys show that in our field, you can still make anywhere from $12 an hour to $100 an hour. Okay? There's still that range, right? Even though a survey that was done by Razika Zanui, I guess it was early 90s, showed that, and recent surveys have shown that it's still the same. So huge, huge range. It fluctuates within our own careers. There are years when I've made what I thought was, woo, lots of money, okay? And other years where I kind of had to really think about what I was spending money on. Benefits really vary, so a lot of differences in terms of what we deal with. So that's the context of the field. Now, having said that, I'd also like to spend a little bit of time talking about us as language teachers. And there are 4 characteristics that I'd like to focus on. One is experience. And what has come out of recent surveys is that almost half of us have more than 10 years experience. And 1/3 have over 15 years experience. So this is a fairly experienced crowd. Now some of you who are new to the field might be saying, well, where is everybody and why isn't it me? But you must be aware that you're joining quite an experienced group. Education, almost 50%, surveys have shown, have the OCT, the teacher's qualification. This is an additional qualification, often done before, but nevertheless additional. Almost 40% have graduate degrees, and this is significant in a field where a graduate degree actually has you pegged, depending on the job you have, depending on the organization you work for, you're actually overqualified in some cases. Certainly for a TESOL Ontario accreditation, that is beyond the minimum. But yet graduate degrees allow access to colleges and to other kinds of positions. This is a word that, again, we talked about, mature. Okay? Not a word I want to use, so put something around it. But my point is, almost 2/3 are over 40. And almost 1/2 are nearing retirement in 10 to 15 years, okay, of that group over 40. So sometimes people describe it as an aging group. I'm not going to use that expression either. But the point remains that it's quite different from some of the K-12 contexts or other teaching contexts. And the last point I want to make is that we are variously employed. And what I mean by that is fewer than half work full-time, and 1/3 teach in multiple sites and evenings. So it takes a certain type of person to work in this kind of field. So this is the context in which we are thinking about language teacher PD, in which we make choices about PD, in which we benefit from PD. This is the context that determines what happens. Now I'd like to move on to give you a working definition of teacher development. And the literature has quite a few different definitions. Farahnaz and I chose this one because it spoke to us specifically on one point. And it's teacher development is a process that takes place over time rather than an event that starts and ends with formal training or graduate education. And I would add to this, rather than an event that takes place in one evening between 6 and 7:30. So the key here is that it's a process, not an event. And this is why we wanted to present this to you now to frame how we look at this. So we're going to go back to some of the questions that we asked you to look at and that we posed initially in our own description. And the first one is, what is the goal of professional development? So before we share what we think, we'd like to share with you some of the comments, some of the work in the literature that again underpinned how we approach this. And that is that teacher development is a term used in the literature to describe a process of continual, intellectual, experimental, and attitudinal growth. Again, process of continual and growth. Continued growth before and throughout teachers' careers. And this is important because there is research that shows that, in fact, depending on the career stage, different PD is required. So there was a recent study I looked at that talked about PD that is specifically geared towards mid-career teachers and how their needs are quite different. We know this intuitively, any of us who've worked with teachers and those of us who've gone through different career stages, but it still is something to have the literature recognize this. And so sometimes research needs to catch up with what we actually know. Teachers continue to evolve in their use and implementation of their skills and knowledge, so it is, again, an evolution. Learning to teach is a lifelong process, and teacher education programs help teachers to begin teaching. There's continuous talk around expanding teacher education programs. So they're always looking at how many more hours can you put in this? 300 hours is enough, 400 hours, 500, make it as long as possible. Let's put in a class on teaching ESP, let's put in a class on assessment, let's put in this class. In the end, there is no program that will have a teacher step out and able to step into any classroom and do everything. The teacher development happens after teacher education. So the next question I'm going to pursue, and bear with me, I've just got a couple more slides before I turn it over to Farahnaz, but I want to share this with you. The other question we asked was, why pursue professional development? Why bother? And what I want to share with you was actually a bit of research that came out of one of these surveys that was done locally. And this was a question you had that we'll hear about, but we posed, in this particular research project, we posed this question to instructors primarily, and we gave them a list of reasons that people have over the years suggested as to why they bothered with professional development. And some of them were enhance my resume, promote my job opportunities, improve my teaching, inspiration, recharging myself professionally, meet and network with other instructors, learn from an expert in the field, try out new strategies in the classroom, learn solutions to classroom problems, reflect on my own practice, and receive accredited recognition. Yes, people actually go to PD to receive accredited recognition. So which of these do you think was rated as the most important by most of the people? Any ideas? The first one? Enhance my resume? No? Improve my teaching. So how many people say improve my teaching? Okay. And what about second? Which one? Can you read it for me? Anybody shout it out.
The third one.
Read it for me, Joan.
Inspiration and recharging.
Okay, inspiration and recharging. Okay, so you say that was the second one? Yeah?
I think meet and network with other instructors.
Meet and network. In fact, it's interesting you bring that one up. I'm going to make a comment about that, but okay. And John?
Receive accredited recognition.
Oh, you believe that that's actually up there, right? Okay. You're a clock of those hours, are you? Okay. All right. Okay. In fact, it's interesting. Maybe Joan participated in these surveys, okay? Because some of your answers, I'll show you what actually came out of it, okay? So the one that was at the top in terms of rated most important by most of the instructors, whoops, which is not really working very well, is improve my teaching, okay? My animation's not quite there, but you can see what's come up. So improve my teaching was actually the top one, okay? But a very close second, and let's see what happens right now, was inspiration and recharging myself professionally. Now it's interesting that, I can't remember now who said networking, but it's interesting that you came up with networking because in terms of other questions that have been asked about the value of conferences, that was actually number one. And I don't have that data with you right now, but that's why it's interesting you raised that. That it wasn't actually the workshops, it was actually the networking. Yeah.
Because you also originally referred to another screen about teachers work in isolation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's we don't often think about that because we tend to focus on the notion of having these workshops that will have you put together a plan. But that's exactly the link between our understanding of the context and what decisions we need to make. So thank you. You basically wrapped up my presentation for me. Okay. Good. But I'll share with you 3 and 4. 3 was try out new strategies in the classroom, and I'm sorry it's not quite looking the way it should. But fair enough, there's a practical side to us, okay? The interesting question about this is, why new strategies? Is it because we observe that something's not working or because we're bored with what we do? These are simplistic responses that may in fact have underlying issues with them. The third was learn from an expert in the field. Okay? And we saw that with the pressure. But we obviously have a notion that we have experts around us and we want to learn from them. And sometimes our experts are our own colleagues. So this is what I wanted to share with you here. Now, let me see where we are. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Farahnaz now, who's going to talk more about not only PD in terms of the underpinnings, but respond to a couple of the other questions as well. Thanks.
Good evening, and thank you for being here with us tonight. As Antonella mentioned, I mean, I've been teaching in TESOL classrooms for a very long time, and one of the things that I would always start these classes the first day is that we never stop learning how to become a teacher and how to become actually a better teacher. So that's how we're starting the session, today. So one of the questions we ask is, what is good PD? And we're relating those experiences basically to what is out there in the literature. Yes, please.
Can you get closer to the mic?
Oh, sure. Is this any better?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm shorter than you, so you have to.
Okay. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing more of what's coming out of the literature with you. So professional development is ongoing. It's as Antonella mentioned, it's a lifelong process. We never stop learning. Teacher education programs are just the beginning. It should be sustained, and it's evolving, cyclical. Evolving in the sense that what makes good PD, 5-10 years ago without technology, 20 years ago without technology, now with technology, is very different. It depends on the individual, what backgrounds, what experiences, what personal experiences we're bringing to this, to the PD ourselves. We have different life experiences, different educational experiences, different, our status as an internationally educated teacher is the problematic dichotomy of native, non-native English-speaking teachers. So it depends. It's very context-specific, and it should be basically personally relevant, knowledge and evidence-based, and we all know about the power of collaborative and community-oriented activities. But Having said all that, the cornerstone is self-awareness and reflection, and I'm going to talk more about these. So what do we mean by self-awareness and self-observation? They're fundamental for professional development, and self-awareness is basically a prerequisite to reflective teaching. It's the awareness that something is working well or that something needs to be improved. It's, as defined by Richards, is a systematic approach to the observation, evaluation, and management of one's own behavior for the purpose of achieving a better understanding and control over one's behavior. So how do we go about self-observation? How do we do it? Decide what you want to learn about or improve. Narrow your choices, because there's so much we can do at one time. Develop an action plan and decide on a time frame. Okay. No, this is on. Oh, okay. Yeah. So reflective teaching or reflective process is the process of introspection and retrospection, focusing specifically on a teacher's actions and thoughts before, during, or after lessons. A distinction made between reflection in action, actually during teaching, versus reflection on action before or after teaching. Farrell has a number of publications and done a lot of research on this aspect, and he defines it as teachers systematically reflecting on their own teaching and taking responsibility for their actions in the classroom. But he makes a distinction between the weak version of reflection and the stronger version. And by the weak version, what he refers to is that reflective practice is just thoughtful practice, but does not lead to action. The stronger version of reflective practice requires that teachers systematically gather data about their practice, and I'm going to talk more about that. So then, the reflection on action actually after teaching becomes more significant than reflection in action during teaching. So a reflective teacher, what does a reflective teacher do? Examines, frames, and attempts to solve the dilemmas of classroom practice.
We're losing you again. The mic is in the wrong position for you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Is aware of and questions the assumptions and values he or she brings to teaching. Is attentive to the institutional and cultural context in which he or she teaches. Sorry for the typo. Takes part in curriculum development and is involved in school change efforts, and takes responsibility for his or her own teaching and professional development. There are a number of different approaches in the literature over, how can professional development basically be pursued. And what we're going to talk about tonight is not the top-down model. It's actually the bottom-up model of the self-initiated or self-directed, basically, teacher development, which can be done, individually or collaboratively, basically. So I'm going to touch on these later, but a list of teaching journals, using cases, stories, critical incidents, the language learning experience, video recording, peer observation, team teaching, action research, and teacher development groups. And I know that these are not new to you, but I'm just providing an overview so that we can have a discussion later. Using and analyzing, cases, stories, and critical incidents, it just builds upon the power of verbalization, whether it's written discourse or oral discourse, and how it brings about, goes back to bringing about a process of problem solving. So stories can be powerful sources for dealing with various situations. We're able to work out the meaning of events and incidents in real world. We can start by reading cases, using case stories and critical incidents, or we can start writing them. These events don't necessarily have to be negative events, something that went wrong in the classroom. They can actually be very positive events that happened in the classroom. And thinking about them individually or discussing them collaboratively basically promotes self-awareness and reflection. One of the ones that I've personally benefited from, I think, and has been speaking to me is the language learning experience. It's basically putting yourself in the shoes of your learners. English is my second language, and I can relate to the students that feel they're more comfortable in some contexts using English versus, for example, other contexts. Or the issues they have, for example, with, let's say, cultural nuances. So the backgrounds that we bring. But not necessarily as a professional development, but I've pursued, for example, well, I had to at some point learn Arabic. And focusing on, for example, how I can read it, but I don't understand a word of what I read. And how is that, for example, possible? Or my attempts to learn, for example, unsuccessfully though, French and German. So language learning experiences, and there are a number of ways that this can be pursued, as simple as watching a television program or listening to a radio broadcast in a language that we don't know. Observing a lesson in an unknown language, and I know that a lot of teacher education programs basically use this in the classroom. Participating in a conversation with a more proficient user of the language that we don't speak very well. And then going back to the experience of reflecting on one's own language learning experience helps in better understanding the language learning experience that your students are going through. Now done more easily than before, video recording. Just for ourselves, not necessarily, they don't necessarily have to be shared with others, but the good thing about them, it enables us to see ourselves from the student's point of view. They're powerful prompts for stimulated recall and helps teachers become aware of habits and mannerisms. What is my catchword? What is it that I use all the time? Where do I stand in the classroom? Who am I facing, for example, in my presentations? Those are things that it's very hard, actually, even for a critical friend to, to relate to us. And it provides an objective record of what really took place in teacher performance, student participation. In a study that I was reading just recently on using the target language only, it was very interesting that once the teachers were audio recorded in a use, for example, English only class, it was only when they were audio recorded they realized how much of the students' native languages they were using in the classroom. And that was as high as 90%. So it's very, hard to realize, that in a classroom once, we're in front of the students. So it's being used quite extensively, actually, as a way of PD. Teaching journals, diary studies, autobiographies, it's going back to, speaking back to the power of verbalization. So a teaching journal is a notebook in which a teacher, very simple definition, writes regularly about teaching experiences. But what it's doing is that it's the act of writing, which begins a reflective, analytical process that helps the writer view teaching more clearly. In writing, we begin not only to observe, but we take the first step in reflecting on or about our practice. So just going back to how it can be a problem-solving process. Writing regularly in a teaching journal can help teachers clarify their own thinking, explore and monitor their own practices. It can be done independently or collaboratively, and teachers can write about what caused them to stop and think. Positive or negative, and ask questions about what happened before this incident, what happened after, and why is it important. And what does this incident basically tell me about my teacher and my teaching, basically? One of my favorite ways of PD, even to this day, I always enjoy sitting in other people's classrooms. Attentively being present in another teacher's classrooms for the purpose of listening to and watching the classroom interactions. And when we're talking about peer observation, we're emphasizing the fact that it's equal power observation. It's not a supervisor sitting, in my classroom. That makes me nervous. But it's about, the descriptive and critical process rather than it being evaluative and judgmental. I mean, simple things as how does this teacher open her classroom? How does she interact? How does she pose questions? And we can go in, with preconceived, questions in mind about certain things that we want to observe, or it can be totally exploratory. And then reflecting on what is it that I like, and what is it that I think works, and what is it that is effective, or what are the things that I like to do differently, and if so, how and why. Doesn't always provide the opportunity, especially in the context where we are teaching. But I mean, team teaching, the benefit of 2 or more teachers partnering to teach a lesson, and this partnership, the purpose is for it to happen in the planning and delivery. So what it does is that it allows team members to take advantage of each other's strength. Obviously, 2 minds work better than mine, better decision-making in all aspects of teaching. It enhances instruction, and both students and teachers can benefit. And this is only if they work well as a team. And if, there's a, good synergy, basically between the two. Otherwise, at worst, it can create a very fragmented and, classroom and instruction. Action research, emphasized a lot in the literature, but what we need to emphasize that it's not action research, it's not the process, that it's research that makes a difference basically in the classroom. It's not research conducted by a researcher, it's basically research conducted by the teacher to systematically change some aspect of their own professional practice or solve an immediate problem. So it's the research that helps teachers in the classroom. It's the reflective process of problem solving. It's research within a specific action as an outcome. And the process, as explained by Farrell, is for teachers to identify an issue, review the literature on the issue, and ask questions to narrow the focus. There's so much that we can do, so the focus should really be narrow, as, for example, what kind of speaking activities involve all my students in the classroom, rather than a big question, how can I improve my teaching, which is a very broad question. Choose data to be collected, and a method of data collection. So, for example, a method of data collection for the same question can be looking at various activities that I can use in the classroom that promote, more student-student interaction, and either audio recording or video recording the classroom. And then collecting, analyzing, and interpreting the data selected, and looking at the data and seeing whether that change of action, whether made a difference, and evaluate the results, and develop and implement and monitor a specific action plan. So the process basically includes planning, observing, acting, and reviewing, and it is definitely cyclical. Teacher development groups, and we emphasized, the fact that collaborative work basically enhances teaching. Language teachers coming together in groups to reflect so that they can complement each other's strength and compensate for each other's limitations. As a group, teachers can achieve outcomes that may not be possible for any of them individually. A group can generate more ideas about classroom issues than any one individual. Teachers can form groups in school, outside of school, or even virtually. In a survey that we conducted, and in an interview that we did with novice teachers, A couple of these teachers, I mean, specifically I remember one of them indicated that collaborative lesson planning or curriculum planning was basically what taught her out of how to teach. And she said that we had, I'm just quoting her, I had the best supervisor as a novice teacher, where we would sit each month as a group to plan the lessons together. And she said, without that, I wouldn't have survived my early years of teaching. I'll stop here with the ideas presented, and I'll pass it on to Antonella so that we can go back to the questions.
What I'm going to do is, before I do that, I'm just going to go back to one of your slides here. This was what Fairness showed you first off, a list of really groovy activities. And she painted quite a rosy picture of how each of these is really beneficial. I just wanted to point out that, of course, perhaps many of you were sitting here listening thinking, I can't do that, I'm not going to do that, who has time after class to write in the journal, I got to get home. So, of course, we recognize that there are all kinds of issues with each of them. And just to share with you a couple, for example, the teacher development groups. I was reading a study recently that talked about how it's all well and good to put a group of teachers in a room together to give them time to kind of talk things through. But what has been observed is that unless you have someone else intervening and stepping in, what they actually do is consolidate the assumptions that they already have. So that growth is limited because you need someone from outside that actually comes in. So you can see that really you need to be combining different aspects. And just as Fairnaz spoke, I was also thinking of the team teaching, I think it was, where you described, was it team teaching, where the novice teacher said that it was basically how they, it was development group, yeah. So the novice teacher described how this was basically what taught her how to teach, being able to lesson plan with other teachers. And that speaks to what I was talking about earlier in terms of different career stages. In the early stages, sure, that is something that you may benefit from. In later years, I can't see that happening. And just recently at York, I saw two language teachers sitting together who had just come to the program, and they were planning a lesson together. I remember thinking, wow, that's amazing, because it's been years since I've done that, and right now that wouldn't work for me. Even though what does work for me is working with a colleague like Fairnaz to do other kinds of things together. So each of these has different aspects that need to be looked at in other ways. It's not to say that pick one, it'll work for you, or put them all together. So I just wanted to make that comment. And now I'm going to go back to where Fairnaz actually left us, because that's what we had planned with you. Okay. These were the 4 questions that we gave you earlier. Now, what we'd like to do is 3 things. One is, we'd like to give you a chance to share some of what you may have scribbled down in your papers. Some of you are motivated to write more, some of you less. But I'd like to see something of what you wrote, because in fact it may be quite different from the kind of content that we chose to be important in answering these questions. We also would like to look at why all of you are here tonight, because I'm still intrigued by this. And then we will open the floor for any questions or comments that anybody has about this or any other topics related. So in terms of the goal of PD, anyone would like to share what they wrote down? Anybody at all? You can.
Nobody mentioned about discussing, if you guys discuss about learners' needs at all, like your experiences so far in my class, because you're so used to a certain system of doing the class. I'm just a novice teacher, so for me, this is what strikes me. That, and also incorporating the ever-changing parameters of education. And you take into consideration, incorporate learners' self-learning motivation. That
So-
didn't come on.
I'm going to, I'll repeat what I'm hearing, because I am mindful that you probably can't hear this, and stop me if I'm misconstruing it. But you said that what I understand is that one of the issues that came up with you was the fact that if I'm right, that it's difficult to break out of the usual routines that are part of the classroom.
Yeah, 'cause you guys have taught for so many years that, you feel, well, this has been working. I don't want to drop the ball here,
Yeah. And what's interesting is that what I've observed, and I think perhaps this certainly goes beyond me, is that we are most trapped in this when we teach quite a lot. What I mean is,
It's normal.
yeah, and the busier you get, the more you will rely on the same tried and true formulas. So it goes back to what Fairness had talked about in terms of reflection. If in fact, you said that it always works. I'm surprised that it would always work. Perhaps we're not noticing when it doesn't work, and perhaps we just don't have the energy to be able to look at it differently. Your other point was about keeping up with changes.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I didn't include in our description of the context, but is a big part of what we do. Some of the changes top down. We've got new curriculum guidelines. Here's a copy. Start looking at them. Some of it is more systemic. Funding has shifted. CLARS has come in for some of you from that particular area. All kinds of changes in government-funded programs. So yeah, how do we keep up? And certainly what I find is that other teaching areas like K-12 also have change. But my sense is that it's not quite, at least as again my sense, that it's not quite in leaps and bounds the way it's been for us. Fairnaz mentions technology from 20 years ago, but that's one of the easier changes in some ways compared to what we've had in the last 6 months even in terms of change. So yeah, good point. Anybody else want to share anything, either from this question or the others, in fact? Anyone?
Well,
Yeah, John.
I've said that the goal is to make ourselves better teachers by exploring new ideas and methods and testing and evaluating our old ideas and methods.
So in fact, what you do is you look for ways of being critical about what you do.
Yeah.
Is it because you saw something not working, or simply because you feel you need to be going to that place?
Both, I guess. Yeah. I guess the emphasis is you're hoping for some new ideas.
But why do you want new ideas?
Because they're better than the old ideas.
Okay. So you're unhappy with the old ideas? Poor John.
I think
giving him a hard time.
isn't that what reflection is? It's evaluating your old ideas, and I didn't. Yeah. So you're testing and evaluating. I guess reflecting.
Yeah. The reason I'm kind of being a bit pushy is because again I'm intrigued by the fact that you're here. And so, many times, at least certainly in my context of supporting teachers in the classroom, we show up and we say, okay, here's reflective practice, everybody reflect, okay? And some bite and some don't. And so the question becomes why? What is it about certain individuals that is actually, and perhaps I'm changing the scope of this, I'm revealing what I'm really interested in, which is looking at how we differ, because you obviously are driven to be doing this. But are you still at Skills for Change?
No, their programs seem to be winding down.
Okay, so as I was saying, your colleagues aren't here, I noticed. So yeah, so obviously you're.
No one's from Skills for Change.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So there is something, this is why I'm kind of pushing what you're defining, because you're obviously not just responding to a problem, you're responding to something else as well.
Maybe something, maybe to expand on what you were saying, or something different, but you had in an earlier slide the idea of regenerating or rejuvenating, but I think not just the teacher, him or herself, but that to keep the job fresh, because I'm sure everyone here can relate to teaching is an exhausting and demanding profession, but if you love it, if you have a passion for it, you need to find ways to keep that job fresh, to keep wanting, or to keep up your same motivation, to deliver the same caliber,
And this is exactly the kind of thing we came to this evening with ourselves. I showed you that I think it was fewer than half are actually work full-time. But nevertheless, working full-time in our field can mean 25 hours of contact time, which is exhausting. And so this notion of regenerating yourself is actually ends up being a primary motive for many people. I agree, rather than necessarily addressing the problem.
To answer question 2, also you mentioned that teachers work in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So very often, I think, even though we know better, we tend to think that these problems that we're experiencing, we're the only ones that they happen to. So even if, say, an event of professional development doesn't really offer a specific, I don't know, new task or new strategy that you're going to use in the classroom, but at least you'll know that these issues that have come up in your classroom don't only affect you, it's other people as well. And I think it's an opportunity to meet other teachers, which very often when you're running from one class to the other, you just don't get to do that.
Yeah, we generally leave and that's it. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, you know, it's a bit depressing to think that expressions like misery loves company and oh, you too, you have this problem too. That's great. But you're absolutely right. Knowing that this is something that is not about you, but that exists elsewhere, is something that helps us reframe what we think and what we do. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Sometimes I think if we put ourselves in the context, look at it in the context of other professions, like I would want to go to a doctor who had done no professional development for the last 25 years, or a car mechanic, or a computer repairs person. So I think sometimes as teachers we don't think that applies to ourselves.
You choose an interesting selection of occupations. Eh? No, it's interesting because we recognize PD for medical doctors because it's very it changes quickly. It's high stakes, new medicines, new etc. I was curious about. It was interesting. You also mentioned car mechanics. Because I'd never thought about it, but certainly again, there's change in the industry. Of course, one of the differences too, it's interesting you mentioned those two because one is highly regulated and the other one is completely unregulated. And we kind of sit in the middle, we're kind of moving towards being regulated, but we really still aren't. And so how does that fit? So yeah, it's an interesting point that you raised. Yeah. And why would you? So as a learner, you're saying learners would want teachers that do engage in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I really like what Jennifer said, because that's kind of an analogy I think about. I think about professions, and I think car mechanics are regulated. I mean, it's all, there's every single thing you have to learn for your apprenticeship. It's all documented. And I think the thing that's sort of interesting about that analogy is, when you think about doctors or plumbers, what they're doing is something technical. There's an attitudinal aspect to what we do, but sometimes a lot of what we talk about is attitudinal stuff. But teaching, and I think especially in K-12, I'm interested in what you're saying, that there's not so much. A lot of teaching, there's lots of technical stuff. I don't mean to use the word tricks, but there's approaches, there's technical stuff. And I think this is what is, I think that's why that's another good analogy about learning actual.
So that it's possible
not
to.
Not about being a nice person.
Right, that there's actual expertise.
That people want to learn.
Yeah, and that there's technique that can be learned.
That can help you if you know that technique.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because in terms of teacher education, we tend here to not focus on it as heavily, but some of the British education programs, the Selfdirected, the Delta, that some of you are familiar with, that's exactly what they do. It's about the technique. It's about how to begin a lesson, how to carry it through, how to deal with specific aspects. Yeah. So yeah, that is something that would bring all those occupations together. Yeah. And Fairness, please feel free to hop up here if you like, by all means. Anybody else? Maybe we'll take one more, and then I'm going to move it. Yeah, Tyson.
Maybe it shouldn't be me then. Anybody else? No?
Is the president allowed to benefit from tonight's PD?
Well, yeah.
Okay, then why don't you go ahead?
I was actually reflecting on the fourth question in particular, because I was thinking about a lot of times, since I organize PD, what is it that makes teachers want to go to it, or what is it that teachers will evaluate it in a good way or a bad way or whatever. And when I think about myself, I think of how easy it is for us to dismiss whether it's a talk or a workshop or something to dismiss it immediately by going, oh, that's not going to work in my context, or that's not going to work for me, and come away sort of prematurely thinking it was bad PD, when in fact I think in my case I try really hard to think of what's my takeaway from that PD. What is it that I can do to adapt? Because a lot of times in my context I teach EAP, and there's not always a lot of PD specifically around EAP. So when I go to talks that are about general ESL and so on, it would be very easy just to go, oh, that doesn't work for me. But there's always a way to adapt it, and there's always a way that I can find something within that PD to take away.
And you raise an interesting point in that we don't tend to have that attitude about textbooks, for example. We're happy enough to pick up a textbook and say, oh yeah, this piece works for me, the rest of it doesn't work for me, and we're okay with that. But not if we have invested our time in something like an event, that we tend to want a package or not. So yeah, it's an interesting point that it's actually an attitude about what professional development is. And in some ways it's possible that it's our fault in that we tend to serve quite a bit. I mean, Tesla Toronto, you're organizing quite a few events. Interesting enough, I don't know about you, Tyson, but I think your involvement on the board is your PD too.
Yes.
Yeah, and certainly in my days when I was with Tesla Toronto board, that was part of the reason that I did it as well. So again, another format, another way of looking at it. Okay, yeah, maybe the last one, then I'm going to move on to my question for you.
Related to how do you know it's good PD, I'd like to bring up the issue of PD that is mandated and PD that is optional. And I have been told that people that go to the optional PD are often people that don't need it. So, and I think in some ways the mandated PD, because we have to take it, we're obligated to, it has some value in it too, even though people may have resistance, or like Jason said over there, and that we can still, and even if it's so general or broad, we don't think it applies to us, something we can take something out.
It's an interesting choice of terms too, mandated, versus you talked about, what was the opposite, optional you used?
Or
yeah. And I think, sorry?
Self-directed.
Self-directed. In fact, I was trying to think of the kind of terms that Fairnaz brought in, the notion of voluntary, for example. When I look at these ideas, what I also see is that there's a difference in the investment, right? So mandated PD is actually a kind of in-service training. And logically, although I know there are employers here who may not agree with this, should be funded as your in-service contribution, right? So it should be, so if it's part of in-service training, it would be paid time, for example, or time that is somehow shaped around your availability. The optional, the voluntary, is when you choose to make the investment. And you're right, it's preaching to the converted, like all of you here today, right? And those are the ones, it's true that the ones who don't need it show up. But at the same time, I think that we need to recognize what we demand in terms of investment from individuals coming forth. And there's some research around the notion of what is really voluntary. That we set up conditions where something appears voluntary and it really isn't. And it could be that you are collecting accreditation hours to jump through some kind of hoop. I don't know. Is that voluntary then? I'm not sure. It changes the context a little bit. But yeah, that's a struggle, and certainly I think our focus is really about people making decisions. And we would distinguish, I think, between the new Canadian language benchmarks are out, and you better sit down and get through the milestones or something, versus what you want to talk about and what's important to you. Yeah. Now, I know there are others who want to talk about this as well. I wanted to have a chance to ask you my question, and that is, why are you here tonight? Particularly because you're quite a different crowd. I know quite a few faces in here, and you're kind of from all over the place. So I'm curious as to why you chose to come out in -18, if that's the weather tonight, right? I know the wind chill is another issue. I don't buy into wind chill. It's cold regardless. So any ideas? Why are you here tonight? Is it really the sandwiches? Maybe it is, and I'm just underestimating it. Yeah.
Just hopefully to see who else is coming out, and maybe a little bit of networking and just a refresher.
Okay. So for you, possibly the most valuable part of tonight was the period out there when you were eating and drinking coffee.
And that's the period that I missed because I got stuck
Oh,
in traffic.
okay. So hopefully this part worked for you too.
No, I really did enjoy this part. I mean, just there was a lot of things touched upon that I didn't even think of it that way, and just reflecting and seeing how you can take something away from it. And it's not just the professional development hours that is a requirement. I think it's good.
Okay, great, good. Anybody else?
I opted to come here because finally there seemed to be some event that was not a series of how to teach this or that point better. And also I was hoping, and it actually happened, to have one of my former professors, meaning Thomas Farrell.
Oh, okay. Yes,
I had the sad experience when I'm not teaching ESL right now in a classroom. I had the sad experience being told by my former boss, do forget what you learned from professors Hayes, Farrell, and others like them. You don't need it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Interesting. Well, if
Wrong.
Tom Farrell
I
heard
have
you.
to disagree with that
Okay.
very violently.
Huh.
So I came to hear about research, and I came to sit with other people who were interested in research. Not that I don't think it's important to pick up new strategies, but I also want to hear about things that are the result of research.
That go beyond the
And I
context.
think there is no either or things can go together.
Okay. This is all useful information for this crowd here, you see, for Tyson Darlene. So, okay, good to hear. Anything else? Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
I came here because I'm quite depressed, I think, about professional development in our field. Because there seems to be a lot of talk about this sort of thing, but when it comes to actually carrying it out, I think there's very little of it going on. And also very little support as well.
So support from whom? Who do you think? Because this was actually something we had considered bringing up tonight.
The people who, the directors and everybody like
Employers,
that. Yeah, I came back from overseas 2 years ago, and one of the things I wanted was professional development. And when I go to a job interview, I'm interviewing them as well. That's how I feel about it. And one of the questions I asked at a community college here in Toronto, do you have peer observation? And the person who was interviewing me said, well, if you feel you need that, our TESOL certificate students do it. And I was in shock. And so I asked this question. I was interviewed by a university in Toronto, and I asked them about peer observation and professional development. They said, well, the problem is time. There's not really time. All the teachers are scheduled for teaching. And also another problem is you're basically strangers, like the isolation thing. People come in here and teach and they go. And so it seems that it's talked about, but there's no way to sustain it at all. You can keep a journal, you can do it on your own, but it seems so isolated and so...
You raise an interesting point, because I've been at the other end where I've been interviewing teachers, and when we've asked them, do you have any questions, that was always a positive question if they asked about PD. Having said that, I'm thinking if they had asked about specific forms of PD that are the kind that we have looked at tonight, I'm not sure I would have been able to give a positive answer. Because much of what the employer was able to provide were things like support from a already too busy supervisor, and workshops, some financial support for attending conferences. So it's quite possible that what you're looking for is in fact the non-traditional forms that these employers were not prepared to respond to, but that would have been depressing. Why peer observation though? Why did you hone in on that one?
I also have a degree in counseling psychology, and I recognize the value of...
You're drawing from positive experiences elsewhere with that.
Yes, and knowing that I think I know what I do, but I know I don't. So just the perspective thing.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Just stemming from that, I also think that peer observation is a good thing to have, but it's just not done. It's just not like, I mean, if I were to ask another co-teacher, I don't think they would do it, just due to time or whatever, but I've also found that it has benefited me. It's a different level of observation than your supervisor. It's very
Yeah. So it's a matter of finding someone, and I think Fairness pointed out there has to be a synergy between individuals for that sort of thing to work. Is that what you were?
Yeah, just to add, yeah, there has to be a certain synergy, and then if there isn't that, how do you get it? Like it takes time over time. It's like a process learning how to actually do peer observation in a way that is beneficial to everybody.
Yeah.
Whether you're bringing in that outsider, a different person from a different area, or like, I just think that's something that takes a lot of work. I think it's so beneficial, but I think it takes time for some people, myself included, like to learn how to do that really well.
And essentially, you are sitting in on a classroom, which is other time. The reality is that most of us finish our classes and we have other lives that we're racing off to. So it's something that is beneficial but has to work for certain individuals and not for others. Yeah.
Because I'm doing my doctoral research around this area. So
Oh, okay.
see what you have to offer.
Okay, so you're actually a researcher who's here to get a few sources.
I'm going to be at Professor Price's like kind of research interest resonates with mine, so I've been kind of stalking her for a while, just to see what she has to say. So.
Okay, yeah. So it's interesting that what this, we would see this as a teacher practitioner or a practitioner-oriented event. But because we do draw on research, it actually brings you in as well, so it's good to see. And someone behind you had their hand up, I think somewhere back there. Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
I was not know why I came, but hearing other people talk, I realized that actually it's amazingly beneficial to hear people like you say, oh, you know, once your class is done, you have to race off to your other life, and that's great to hear because I'm here because my husband's at home with the kids, but it's good because, you know, I have colleagues who don't have children, for example, but who will, you know, spend maybe 4 extra hours physically at school every day, like prepping and doing stuff, and I like rush out and rush in, like, oh my God, where do you get all these?
You feel the guilt, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like somehow you're not as good a teacher, yeah. Oh no, welcome to my world. Yeah. And bad news doesn't change either. Right? So, yeah, we're happy to be here, but we don't mind rushing out too. So, yeah, but it doesn't mean that you're not investing. It doesn't mean that you are any different. It's a matter of what resources we draw on, absolutely. Okay, Fairness, is there anything you wanted to bring up or highlight? No? Okay, any questions or comments? I think we'll start wrapping up because we're at 7:15. Yeah?
Well, it's just something I wanted to share. The lady in front of me and I sometimes co-taught. It was quite informal. It was without the boss knowing about it.
That's what we did.
And
I presume one of you was on the payroll for that class.
Yeah, it was great because the other one could relax. But we would take turns, you know, speaking to the class, and directing the activities, and that way we got to do peer observation. And to me, the greatest benefit of peer observation is the ability to imagine myself as a student in a class of in the same program.
And obviously the both of you work well together, and that's why it works for you. Yeah. But yeah, funny that you had to do it on the slide. Yeah. So that tells you how much support there are for some of these ideas. Yeah.
So I do want to say, with the TDSB, we were offered mentorship and mentoree several years ago. I forget. And so we were matched, and they, like Alison referenced earlier, we had lots of training how to do it. One was not a specialist or more advanced or more experienced. So we went to observe the person's class and got feedback and gave feedback, and they came and observed our class. I think it was a nightmare of logistics, but it really worked in terms of learning.
And it was pitched, I presume, to support novice teachers. Is that right?
No, not
oh, not at all. Okay,
not at all.
Great. In fact, TESOL Ontario, I noticed in their last email, is opening a mentor or a mentorship, not program, but a list of individuals who are willing to mentor other teachers. Yeah. Interesting. Lisa, you're at the other end of that program. Do you think it worked well?
Well, I'm glad that Kelly mentioned it because I'd forgotten a little bit about it. I was asking my colleague Karen if she remembered. There was a lot of logistics. There was the pre-training before you could go and match up and observe, and then you had to get a supply instructor in to replace the instructor. So logistically, it was really tricky. But we wanted to do it as a means of offering a different kind of PD. I mean, why should it always be sort of top-heavy and the experts coming in? I mean, they know best. They're in the classroom. So I'm glad it was successful for you, and I think it was for everybody who participated, but it was a real challenge to work it all out.
And especially because much of it would have landed on your shoulders as a supervisor and support person.
Yeah.
So that's the program you should have been interviewed by. Sorry, you didn't quite match up there.
Can I ask a question? The research you showed at the beginning, do you have it in more detail and available?
In fact, what we were going to say was that we weren't able for tonight to provide a list for you, but we will put one together. And Tyson, I don't know what the best way is for you. Do you want to post it on your website or whatever you want to do? So yeah, we will. There are a few online links that we had hoped to bring up, and it was just too much. So yeah, definitely.
Are you referring to the references or the research?
The surveys that, from the surveys.
Well, it depends on which one of those. Like for example, I drew partly on the survey that we did for the post-TESOL certificate framework project. It's actually an unpublished report. So I couldn't post that because it is unpublished and it basically belongs to CIC and TESOL Ontario. However, certainly we can include references that go back to some of the other data.